Even some 15 years after BioShock's release, there's not a doubt in my mind that Fort Frolic is one of the best video game levels ever created. And in this video, I'm going to take a closer look at it from beginning to end to try and better explain why it's so completely and utterly brilliant. The underlying reason for the creation of Rapture is so succinctly surmised during BioShock's spectacular opening minutes.
A city where the artist would not fear censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
And you see the results of that mantra immediately after. You see it in the bathysphere used to journey down to the city, you see it in the city itself, and of course, you see it in what is perhaps the city's most defining scientific discovery, plasmids. And that's all well and good, but what about the artists Rapture's founder Andrew Ryan just mentioned, those who have been able to live a life in Rapture free from the overbearing gaze of the censors, censors far stricter, I might add, than any they'd have to tackle in our day and age. You can see their contribution throughout the city in the form of the Art Deco stylings of Rapture itself, its fashion, and even in the many posters stuck to its walls. But without doubt, it's surely Fort Frolic which most embodies the spirits of those artists unbound from their usual restraints more than any other area in the game. Before you enter Fort Frolic proper, you meet its de facto leader, Sander Cohen, and as twisted sculptures of former visitors descend from the ceiling around the bathysphere and a haunting melody kicks in, you get your first indication that the area may no longer be beholden to the artists and their endeavours, but instead to Cohen himself, coloured by his descent into madness and desire for absolute perfection.
Time was, you could get something decent on the radio. The artist has a duty to seduce the ear and delight the spirit. So say goodbye to those two blowhards, and hello to an evening with Sander Cohen.
Although that's not to say that Cohen wasn't at least somewhat disturbed before Rapture descended into depravity. He was a close ally of Andrew Ryan when the city was in its prime, and was heavily involved in taking children from Frank Fontaine's supporters, mainly young girls, and trafficking them to the highest bidders, or to Andrew Ryan himself, so he could turn them into little sisters. This man was no angel prior to the city's fall, and that's something that absolutely should be acknowledged before we proceed any further. After the bathysphere leading deeper into the city is cordoned off, and the one you use to enter Fort Frolic is similarly blocked, it quickly becomes very clear that you're trapped in the area until you've succumbed to Cohen's whims. Upon entering Fort Frolic, he also then jams Atlas and Ryan's radio transmissions.
No need to thank me for jamming the transmissions of those boors, Atlas and Ryan. Let them have their squabble. The artist, yes, the artist knows there is richer earth to till.
This is a stroke of genius, as it helps frame the area as its own short story, or play of sorts, which is very much in keeping with the theme of the level itself. You're stuck, left alone with Cohen, mostly disconnected from BioShock's overarching narrative. Of course, it's not entirely disconnected, you have to engage with Cohen in order to continue working towards your primary objective of hunting down Andrew Ryan, but the story of Jack and Fort Frolic is in general one set very much apart from the rest of the game's narrative. At surface level, Fort Frolic is an extended item hunt, and a very good one at that. Your first task is to visit the Fleet Hall Theatre, where you watch one of Cohen's disciples, a man by the name of Kyle Fitzpatrick, meet a very grisly end due to his lack of ability on the piano.
Oh, Cohen, you sick fuck, let me out of there!
After which Cohen requests that you take a photo of his lifeless body before he reveals his plans for you.
And now you've got Fitzpatrick caught in his moment of glory. It seems you've got the eye of the shutterbug, little moth. Now, head to the atrium and place his photograph in my masterpiece. And so our collaboration commences.
He describes your partnership as a collaboration, and I love that he introduces that idea immediately after the scene involving Fitzpatrick. Cohen wants the two of you to work together, and you have just seen exactly what happens to those who don't perform to the high standard he expects. It's a really lovely way of raising the stakes from the outset. Returning to the main area, Cohen requests that you place the newly taken photo in his Quadtych before you're left to hunt down, kill and photograph the remaining 3 disciples at your own leisure. The most engaging and unsettling of the trio is by far Martin Finnegan. As you enter his area, you'll hear him whispering to you,
"I can see your breath."
And after coming across a room filled to the brim with frozen splicers, it's not long before you find yourself in the same position. Fortunately, however, he's not too difficult to dispatch, especially if you're playing on easy mode like I was when recording the footage for this video. Unfortunately, the next 2 encounters with Cohen's disciples I don't think are quite as intense. After again being ambushed and trapped, this time by disciple Silas Cobb, you eventually manage to escape using a vent before dispatching him. This is followed by a run-in with Hector Rodriguez, which again doesn't set the world alight as he sprints from a bar while you fire round after round into him. There is one notable thing about your meeting with Rodriguez, however, although it's nothing to do with actually taking him on. I know towards the beginning of this video I mentioned that this section of the game is mostly disconnected from everything else, but there is one instance where this isn't entirely the case. Before Rodriguez will spawn into the area, it's first mandatory that you watch a few scenes involving the ghost, so to speak, of Jasmine Jolene, which culminate in her murder at the hands of Andrew Ryan.
Sorry, Mr. Ryan, I didn't know. I didn't know you had something to do with it. What are you doing? No, don't, please. I loved you, don't, please, no.
There's also an audio diary near her corpse, which further hints at the big twist to come soon after. And while forcing you to watch these scenes in order to progress, rather than them acting as a reward for those who properly search Fort Frolic, is perhaps a little too much like handholding considering BioShock is a game all about rewarding exploration, I can see the logic behind the decision. You're given just enough information that you know something strange is going on, and I suppose in a way they help ensure that you can look back on Fort Frolic and still think of it as part of the wider narrative, even if you're someone who didn't particularly enjoy Sander Cohen's separate story arc. While the confrontations with the disciples themselves I'm not overly enamoured with, I don't think it matters a great deal, as in my mind that's not where Fort Frolic's real strength lies. What I personally love about the level is the way it constantly keeps you on your toes outside of completing your tasks for Cohen. The design of Fort Frolic itself is very sensible in that it features 2 hub areas, on the edges of which are many separate shops, bars and other locations. It's easy enough to work your way around the outside of each area fairly logically, but what you find within those different locations is anything but. There's a constant feeling that developer Irrational Games is trying to mess with you in any way they can, and it makes for a gripping experience. If you attempt to grab one of the many items placed in shop windows, you'll raise the alarm and have to fight your way to safety. When you first use the lift in the theatre on your way to Fitzpatrick, you'll be ambushed, and there's another, even better example of this later on. Upon entering the tobacconist, you'll likely see the sign which says "More items downstairs," just tempting you to head to the shop's lower levels. You're rewarded with more items for following the direction the sign points in, including an upgrade station, but equally, you'll also be punished for your inquisitiveness as a gang of splicers enters the shop behind you. The examples I've just listed are all great, but I think it's fair to say that none of them compare to the statues you frequently encounter throughout Fort Frolic. They pose little threat in the first hub area, although they're extremely unsettling nonetheless. In the men's bathroom, you'll find these terrifying specimens, and the 3 sat around the table not too far away are incredibly unnerving. There's little background noise other than a faint hum, and you can hear what sounds like a little girl's voice. There's also a statue that looks suspiciously like Sander Cohen to be found in this first area. It's clearly meant to look like him, and the audio diary recorded by him next to it all but confirms that, but it's definitely not Cohen in disguise as he's holed up in the theatre.
Could you possibly think I would meet with my public now, when I'm preparing? Unbelievable.
What it means, I'm honestly not sure, but it's an interesting little addition all the same. The second hub area is where things are really taken up a notch in this regard, and it begins to feel like the almost schizophrenic nature of Fort Frolic as a whole is a reflection of Sander Cohen's warped state of mind. As you enter Sinclair Spirits, you'll be met by not 1, not 2, but 6 statues lining your path, and it's hard not to be a little spooked by this jump scare in the basement shortly after. Although that being said, it is very similar to one which happens earlier in the game during your visit to the medical pavilion pavilion, so there's a chance you may have seen it coming. Making your way back to the hub area, you'll also be concerned to see that the statues previously sat near the entrance are now gone, although it won't be long before you encounter them again. There's a good chance you'll spot another sign similar to that in the tobacconist placed directly opposite the shop you've just left to push you in that direction. That shop housed the button you needed to press to remove the grates blocking your path down the stairs, and so it's very likely you'll head there next, at which point you'll be ambushed yet again. It's really clever sequential game design that pushes you in the right direction and sets up the scare perfectly. You enter the shop and see the statues, you press the button behind the counter, you leave the shop and notice that the statues are gone, before heading down to the newly unlocked area, which is deliberately placed nearby so you can have the pants scared off you yet again. I mentioned a little earlier that the more you explore Fort Frolic, the more it begins to reflect Cohen himself, and it's this connection between Fort Frolic's design and Cohen's psyche that I think demonstrates so perfectly why BioShock was considered one of the most immersive, well thought out games when it released, and still is to this day. You aren't just exploring Fort Frolic and thereby learning of its place in Rapture, nor are you doing your best to simply overcome Sander Cohen. It's more complex than that. I mean, you are definitely doing both of those things, but you're also learning about each through the lens of the other. Seeing Fort Frolic, but in its more twisted form, you slowly, or maybe fairly quickly, come to understand exactly who Cohen is, but through the lens of the level itself. The level design essentially acts as a reflection of who Cohen has become. His horrifying works of art dotted across Fort Frolic illustrate perfectly the madness and egotism he has succumbed to, and by extension, Cohen himself reflects the ideals Fort Frolic and the city itself were built on. A once great man, now left as little more than a withered husk of his former self due to the intoxicating effect Rapture had on him. It makes you ask the question, if this is what the artist has become when truly free from the censor, is it really worth it? And what I've laid down there is the crux of why I believe Fort Frolic is such an extraordinary piece of work. Jordan Thomas, Fort Frolic's lead designer, who would also later go on to direct BioShock 2, said of Cohen's effect on the city, the idea was to infuse the space with his presence everywhere you looked, and that's certainly what Jordan and his team managed. The mixture of living and dead plaster statues spread across Fort Frolic serve as a monument to Cohen, and the area as a whole acts as the art gallery in which they're displayed. Indeed, even you the player are illuminated by a spotlight as you explore the area's central hubs. Jack becomes an actor himself and Fort Frolic the stage, with Cohen, the crazed director, delivering his orders from afar. These are not things to be viewed in isolation, but rather they are symptomatic of what's going on inside the head of Cohen himself. He's a man who lives in a world where the theatres no longer have an audience, galleries no longer have visitors, a world where what little audience remains have now become the attractions themselves. His desire for perfection is so great, he even sends you out to eliminate his former disciples, men whose lack of talent he can no longer tolerate. It's an incredibly unsettling way of thinking. Only in death does Cohen consider any of them to be of any real use artistically, and so they remain, displayed in memoriam at the centre of Fort Frolic. This idea extends to your final moments in the area too, as you battle a horde of splicers while Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers plays in the background. It's not really a battle, it's a dance, and you're constantly encouraged to move across the metaphorical stage by the enemies appearing from all directions. And then, once you're the last man standing, Cohen finally considers your performance to have reached its conclusion, and so he finally allows you to leave, comfortable in the knowledge that you're a master of your own art, happy for the curtain to now come down. Rapture provided the perfect outlet for Cohen's perfectionism and unbridled egotism to run rampant, and in return, Cohen himself becomes a study in why restraints for artists, for scientists, for businessmen, existed on the surface in the first place. It's a theme that runs through much of what you find in Rapture. What is the point of this libertarian paradise if it ends with the most corrupt, the most immoral, the most awful being allowed to run rampant? Nowhere connects this idea of the city reflected in the person and the person reflected in the city better than Fort Frolic and Sander Cohen. It's not just a standout moment in the standout game that is BioShock, it's an incredible combination of level design, world building and characterization, the likes of which we so very rarely witness. In short, in the words of Cohen himself, my god, it's beautiful. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, boys, girls and splicers. Would you kindly consider subscribing to the channel, and do let me know your thoughts in the comments as it all helps the channel grow, and hopefully we'll meet again soon.